The morning sun cast a golden glow over the rolling countryside, its rays breaking through a veil of mist that hugged the earth. Birds chirped softly, their melodies intertwining with the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze. Amid this tranquil setting, a lone figure stood before the imposing gates of an estate that seemed frozen in time. Clara Mitchell, clutching a weathered leather bag, gazed at the towering iron gates with a mix of awe and trepidation. Behind those gates lay Hawthorne Manor, a sprawling Gothic mansion shrouded in both grandeur and grief. Hawthorne Manor had once been the heart of laughter and celebration, but now it loomed with a quiet sorrow. Its owner, Jonathan Hawthorne, a once vibrant businessman, had retreated from the world after the untimely death of his beloved wife. For 2 long years, the house had fallen silent, mirroring the unspoken pain of its youngest resident, 8-year-old Nathan. Since his mother's passing, Nathan had withdrawn into a shell of silence, communicating only through fleeting glances and wordless gestures. Therapists, counselors, and specialists had tried to pierce the veil of his solitude, but none had succeeded. Now, Clara stood at the threshold of this fractured world, summoned not for her words, but for her silence. A gifted musician and a woman of quiet strength, Clara had been recommended as a last hope. Though mute since childhood, she had a unique ability to express her emotions through music, something those who knew her described as magical. Yet, as she stood there, doubts crept into her mind. Could she truly make a difference where so many had failed? Could her music reach a boy who had turned away from the world? The gates creaked open slowly, revealing a shadowed path lined with ancient oaks. Clara took a deep breath and stepped forward, the weight of her mission pressing on her shoulders. She didn't know what awaited her inside the mansion, but one thing was certain. This was not just a job. It was a journey that would test her patience, her resilience, and her faith in the unspoken power of human connection. As Clara approached the grand wooden doors, her heart quickened. Beyond those doors lay a story yet unwritten, one filled with the whispers of a family yearning for healing and the possibility of hope. Would her music be enough to break through the silence? Or would Hawthorne Manor remain a place of shadows and sorrow? Only time would tell. The massive wooden doors of Hawthorne Manor swung open, their hinges groaning with a weight that echoed through the quiet courtyard. Standing on the threshold was Mrs. Beatrice Winslow, the manor's long-serving housekeeper. Her sharp gray eyes took in every detail of Clara Mitchell, from her simple navy coat to the worn leather shoes that had seen better days. Her expression was unreadable, but the stiff line of her lips spoke volumes. "You're Clara Mitchell?" Mrs. Winslow asked, her voice as precise as her starched white apron. Clara nodded silently, her hand instinctively tightening on the strap of her bag. Though she had grown accustomed to meeting new people without words, the weight of Mrs. Winslow's scrutiny made her feel small, as though her very presence needed justification. The housekeeper's gaze lingered a moment longer before she stepped aside. "Come in," she said curtly, motioning for Clara to enter. "Remember, this is not a place for disruptions. Silence is the rule here. Do your job, follow the schedule, and don't overstep." Clara stepped inside, and the chill of the house seemed to seep into her bones. The grand foyer was dimly lit, its marble floors reflecting the faint glow of sunlight that filtered through the stained glass windows. Portraits of stern-faced ancestors lined the walls, their painted eyes seeming to follow her every move. The air was heavy, laden with the scent of polished wood and faded memories. Mrs. Winslow led her through the manor, pointing out rooms with quick, clipped explanations. "The living room is there. The dining hall is through that door. The West Wing is strictly off-limits unless Mr. Hawthorne requests your presence." Her tone left no room for questions. Finally, they reached a narrow hallway at the back of the house. Mrs. Winslow stopped in front of a plain wooden door and opened it. "This is your room," she said. Clara peeked inside. The space was modest, with a single bed, a small wardrobe, and a window that overlooked the inner courtyard. It was far from luxurious, but she had expected no more. She placed her bag on the bed and turned to Mrs. Winslow, nodding her thanks. "Change into your uniform and meet me in the kitchen in 5 minutes," Mrs. Winslow instructed, her tone brooking no delay. Your first task awaits. Clara hurried to comply, pulling on the plain gray uniform that hung in the wardrobe. The fabric felt rough against her skin, a stark reminder of her new role. She glanced at herself in the small mirror, her reflection a picture of quiet determination. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she resolved to face them with patience and grace. When Clara arrived in the kitchen, Mrs. Winslow was already there, bustling about with practiced efficiency. "You'll prepare breakfast for Master Nathan," she said without looking up. "Toast with orange marmalade, fresh fruit, and a glass of milk. And remember, don't speak." "Oh, that's right, you can't." The comment was delivered with a smirk, but Clara remained unfazed. She moved to the counter and began her work with steady hands, slicing fruit and toasting bread with meticulous care. When the tray was ready, she lifted it carefully and followed Mrs. Winslow up the grand staircase to Nathan's room. Mrs. Winslow knocked briskly before opening the door. "Master Nathan, breakfast," she announced before stepping aside to let Clara in. The room was bathed in soft morning light, the blue curtains drawn halfway to reveal a view of the sprawling gardens below. Shelves lined with books and toys framed the space, but it was the figure seated in the corner that drew Clara's attention. Nathan sat cross-legged on the floor, his small frame hunched over a sketchbook. His dark hair fell across his face as he scribbled aimlessly, the pages covered in jagged lines and messy shapes. He didn't look up when Clara entered, nor did he acknowledge the tray she placed gently on the table nearby. Clara hesitated, unsure whether to approach or retreat. In the end, she chose neither, taking a seat on a chair near the door and folding her hands in her lap. She sat quietly, watching Nathan without staring, her presence unobtrusive yet steady. Minutes passed in silence, broken only by the faint scratching of Nathan's pencil. Clara's heart ached at the sight of him, a boy so young yet so burdened by grief. She wanted to reach out, to offer him comfort, but she knew it would take more than words or gestures to breach the wall he had built around himself. As the day unfolded, Clara fell into a rhythm. She brought Nathan his meals, cleaned his room, and maintained her silent presence. Each interaction was brief and uneventful, yet she couldn't shake the feeling that something unspoken was beginning to stir. That evening, as she sat alone in her modest room, Clara pulled out her violin. She had brought it with her not out of hope, but out of necessity. It was her only true voice, the only way she could express the emotions that words failed to convey. She ran her fingers over the strings, her mind racing with thoughts of the boy upstairs. Tomorrow, she decided, she would play. Not for herself, but for Nathan. Perhaps her music could reach him in a way that no one else had been able to. It was a fragile hope, but it was enough to keep her going. Clara closed her eyes and drew the bow across the strings, the soft melody filling her tiny room with a bittersweet warmth. It was a song of healing, of connection, and of hope, a song that, if she had her way, Nathan would hear. The morning dawned quietly over Hawthorne Manor, but Clara's resolve was stronger than ever. She carried her violin to the courtyard, its polished wood gleaming faintly in the soft sunlight. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of dewy grass and blooming flowers. Clara positioned herself beneath a grand oak tree, the shade offering a quiet retreat where the notes of her music could travel freely. Drawing the bow across the strings, Clara began to play a melody that seemed to echo her innermost feelings, gentle yet powerful, fragile yet resilient. The notes floated upward, weaving through the open windows of the manor, reaching the silent corners of the vast home. Upstairs, Nathan sat on his bed, his sketchbook abandoned beside him. At first, the music was just a faint hum, but as it grew louder, it stirred something deep within him. His small hands trembled as he moved to the window, drawn by the unfamiliar sound. Peering out, he saw Clara, her eyes closed, her body swaying slightly with the rhythm. For the first time in months, he felt something other than the heavy weight of grief, a spark of curiosity. Tentatively, Nathan slipped out of his room and padded quietly down the grand staircase, his steps cautious yet purposeful. Clara, lost in her music, didn't notice him at first. It wasn't until she opened her eyes at the end of the piece that she saw him standing a few feet away, his wide eyes filled with wonder. She smiled softly, lowering her violin in a gesture of invitation. Nathan hesitated, then took a step closer. His gaze fell to the violin in her hands, and without speaking, he reached out, his fingers brushing the strings gently. Clara held it steady, allowing him to explore. His touch was tentative but curious, and Clara could see the beginnings of a connection forming. From that day, Nathan began seeking out Clara whenever she played. He never spoke, but his presence alone was a victory. Each time she played, he would sit a little closer, his expression softening as the days passed. Clara played everything from soft lullabies to cheerful tunes, each note carefully chosen to reach the boy's guarded heart. Nathan's quiet transformation didn't go unnoticed. Mrs. Winslow, ever watchful, observed the small changes in his demeanor. How he lingered in Clara's presence, how his once vacant eyes now held a glimmer of life. Though skeptical at first, the housekeeper began to regard Clara with a grudging respect. One afternoon, as Clara played a playful melody in the garden, Nathan surprised everyone by giggling. A soft, fleeting sound that carried more weight than any words could. Clara's heart soared, but she kept her reaction subtle, sensing that any sudden attention might cause him to retreat. Encouraged by his response, Clara decided to bring Nathan further into her world of music. One evening, she placed her violin gently into his small hands and guided him as he held the bow. Together, they drew a single note, its sound resonating through the quiet room. Nathan's eyes lit up, and for the first time, a shy smile spread across his face. As their bond deepened, Nathan began expressing himself in new ways. He no longer avoided Clara, and though he still didn't speak, his drawings became more vibrant and detailed. One day, he handed her a picture of a violin, surrounded by bright, swirling colors. Clara pressed the drawing to her heart, her eyes brimming with tears. But not everyone approved of this unconventional approach. Mrs. Julia Blake, Nathan's speech therapist, arrived unannounced one afternoon, her heels clicking sharply against the stone path as she marched into the garden. Her sharp eyes narrowed as she took in the sight of Nathan sitting beside Clara, his small hand resting on the violin. "What is going on here?" Mrs. Blake demanded, her voice cutting through the peaceful atmosphere like a blade. "This boy needs structured therapy, not frivolous music sessions." Clara stood silently, her violin cradled protectively in her arms. Mrs. Blake turned her attention to Jonathan, who had appeared at the edge of the courtyard, drawn by the commotion. "Mr. Hawthorne," she began, her tone dripping with authority, "I must insist that you reconsider this arrangement. Music is not going to make Nathan talk. He needs professional intervention, not this, whatever this is." Jonathan's gaze shifted between Mrs. Blake and Clara, his expression conflicted. "But Nathan seems happier," he said hesitantly. "He's engaging more. Surely that's progress?" Mrs. Blake scoffed, crossing her arms. "Happiness is not the same as recovery. If you truly want your son to heal, you'll need to let this experiment end." Clara's heart sank, but she kept her composure. She knew she couldn't compete with the words of a professional, but deep down, she believed in the connection she had built with Nathan. As she turned to leave, she caught a glimpse of the boy watching from the garden steps, his wide eyes filled with fear and confusion. The seeds of doubt had been sown, but Clara resolved not to give up. If this was her last chance to reach Nathan, she would give it everything she had. That evening, she played a soft, hopeful melody under the stars, pouring her heart into every note. And though Nathan didn't come to the window, she felt the weight of his presence, listening quietly in the shadows. The next morning, Clara's steps felt heavier as she carried Nathan's breakfast tray to his room. The tension following Mrs. Blake's accusations lingered like a dark cloud over the manor. She couldn't shake the memory of Nathan's fearful eyes as he watched the exchange the day before. As she entered his room, Nathan sat on the floor as usual, his sketchbook open before him. But today, he wasn't drawing. Instead, he stared blankly at the page, his shoulders hunched and his head bowed low. Clara set the tray down gently on the table, her every movement deliberate and quiet. Nathan didn't look up. His silence was no longer the quiet curiosity she had grown used to. It was a silence steeped in unease. Clara's heart ached at the sight of him retreating once more into the shell she had worked so hard to crack. That evening, Clara carried her violin to the garden, her mind swirling with doubt. She had played for Nathan so many times, each note carefully chosen to soothe and connect, yet Mrs. Blake's words gnawed at her confidence. Was her music truly helping, or was it just a fleeting distraction? As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the estate, Clara began to play. This time, the melody was different. It was a song of longing, of yearning to reach someone lost in the shadows. The notes were softer, almost pleading, each one carrying the weight of her hope. Unbeknownst to Clara, Nathan stood at his window, watching her. His small hands clutched the frame as he leaned forward, his wide eyes reflecting the sunset's light. The melody wrapped around him like a warm embrace, stirring something deep within. Minutes later, Clara felt a presence behind her. She turned slowly, her music fading as she saw Nathan standing barefoot on the garden path. In his hands, he held a folded piece of paper. He extended it to her wordlessly, his gaze fixed on the ground. Clara took it with gentle hands and unfolded it carefully. Inside was a drawing of her violin surrounded by bright, swirling colors. At the bottom, in shaky but legible letters, Nathan had written a single word: stay. Tears welled in Clara's eyes as she knelt to meet Nathan's gaze. She couldn't speak, but she didn't need to. Her smile, soft and radiant, said everything she couldn't put into words. She reached out and gently ruffled his hair, a silent promise that she would stay as long as he needed her. From that moment, something shifted. Nathan began to seek her out more often, sitting closer when she played and even reaching for her violin with curious hands. The connection they had forged, fragile yet profound, grew stronger with each passing day. But their progress did not sit well with Mrs. Blake. Frustrated by what she saw as an affront to her professional authority, she returned to Hawthorne Manor unannounced one afternoon. Her heels clicked sharply against the marble floors as she marched to Jonathan's study, her expression tight with determination. "Mr. Hawthorne," she began without preamble, "I must insist that you take immediate action. This situation with Clara is not only unproductive, but potentially harmful to Nathan's recovery. He needs structured therapy, not this emotional indulgence." Jonathan sat behind his desk, his fingers steepled in thought. He had seen the change in Nathan, the way the boy's eyes lit up when Clara was near. But Mrs. Blake's credentials weighed heavily on his mind. "He has been engaging more," Jonathan said cautiously. "He even wrote a word the other day." Mrs. Blake's laugh was cold. "One word, Mr. Hawthorne? That is not progress. If anything, it's a distraction. If you truly care about your son's well-being, you'll let her go." Clara, who had been passing by the study, froze at the sound of her name. She couldn't hear Jonathan's reply, but the heaviness in his voice was unmistakable. Moments later, Mrs. Winslow approached her with a quiet but somber expression. "Mr. Hawthorne wants to see you in his study," she said, her voice uncharacteristically gentle. Clara entered the room with a calm facade, though her heart raced. Jonathan stood by the window, his back to her. When he turned, his expression was conflicted. "Clara," he began, his voice low, "I cannot begin to express how grateful I am for what you've done for Nathan. You've brought light back into his life in a way I never thought possible." He paused, his hands tightening into fists. "But Mrs. Blake is convinced that he needs more professional intervention. I've decided to let you go." The words struck Clara like a physical blow, but she held herself steady. She bowed her head in acknowledgement, her expression calm even as her heart broke. Jonathan's voice wavered as he added, "This isn't about you. It's about doing what's best for my son." Clara left the study, her steps heavy as she made her way to her room. She began packing her belongings, each item feeling like a piece of her soul being stripped away. As she descended the grand staircase the next morning, her suitcase in hand, Nathan appeared at the top of the stairs. Tears streamed down his face as he cried out, "Don't go, Clara!" The words echoed through the manor, freezing everyone in their tracks. Jonathan rushed to the base of the stairs, staring at his son in stunned silence. It was the first time Nathan had spoken since his mother's death. Nathan ran down the stairs and threw his arms around Clara, sobbing into her skirt. "Don't leave me," he whispered, his voice trembling but clear. Jonathan's chest tightened as he watched the scene unfold. The truth hit him like a wave. Mrs. Blake had been wrong. Clara's quiet presence and unwavering patience had done what no therapy could. Tears filled Jonathan's eyes as he approached them. Placing a hand on Clara's shoulder, he said softly, "I was wrong. I should have trusted you. Please, Clara, stay. Nathan needs you, and so do I." Clara looked into Jonathan's eyes, her own brimming with tears. She nodded, her smile breaking through the pain. At that moment, the darkness that had loomed over Hawthorne Manor began to lift, replaced by a warmth that promised healing and hope. The morning after the emotional plea, the atmosphere at Hawthorne Manor felt lighter, as though the years of grief and tension had finally begun to unravel. Clara stayed, and her presence brought a renewed sense of purpose to the household. Jonathan wasted no time in confronting the source of their recent turmoil. Mrs. Blake arrived at the manor later that day, confident that her influence over Jonathan would be enough to cement her position. However, as she entered the drawing room, she was met with Jonathan's steely gaze. Clara stood quietly in the corner, Nathan at her side, his small hand wrapped tightly around hers. "Mrs. Blake," Jonathan began, his tone calm but resolute, "I've decided to let you go." The therapist's confident demeanor faltered. "Mr. Hawthorne, surely you're not serious. Nathan needs my expertise, my—" "What Nathan needs is someone who truly understands him," Jonathan interrupted, his voice firm. "And that person is Clara. She's done more for my son in a few weeks than you have in all your sessions." Mrs. Blake's protests were cut short as Jonathan stepped forward, his stance unyielding. "I trusted you to help my son, but instead, your arrogance blinded you to what he truly needed. Effective immediately, your services are no longer required." As Mrs. Blake left in a huff, Clara felt a wave of relief wash over her. For the first time, she saw Jonathan not as a grieving man weighed down by indecision, but as a father willing to fight for his child's happiness. That evening, Jonathan joined Clara and Nathan in the garden. As Clara played a soft melody on her violin, Nathan began humming along, a tentative but unmistakable sign that he was finding his voice again. Jonathan watched them, his heart swelling with gratitude. He realized that his decision to trust Clara wasn't just about Nathan. It was about rebuilding his family and finding hope after years of sorrow. Days turned into weeks, and life at Hawthorne Manor transformed. Where there had once been silence, there was now music, laughter, and the warmth of a home truly alive. Clara's presence became indispensable, not just to Nathan, but to Jonathan as well. Jonathan began spending more time with Clara and Nathan, joining their walks through the gardens, their quiet dinners in the kitchen, and their stargazing sessions on the terrace. He found himself captivated by Clara's quiet strength, her ability to communicate without words, and the way she had brought his son back to life. One evening, as the three of them sat under the stars, Nathan resting his head on Clara's lap, Jonathan turned to her. "You've given us more than I ever thought possible," he said softly. "You didn't just help Nathan. You've changed my life too." Clara looked at him, her eyes reflecting the light of the moon. She couldn't speak, but her smile said everything he needed to know. The bond between them deepened, growing through shared moments of caring for Nathan and simple acts of kindness. Jonathan began to open up about his own struggles, the guilt he felt over his wife's death and the fear that he would never be enough for his son. Clara listened, her quiet presence a balm to his wounds. One sunny afternoon, Jonathan found Clara in the rose garden, her violin resting beside her as she tended to the flowers. He approached her, his heart pounding with the weight of what he was about to say. "Clara," he began, his voice steady but tinged with emotion, "when you first came here, I thought you were just here to help Nathan. But you've done so much more than that. You've shown me what it means to heal, to hope, and to love again." Clara's eyes widened, her hands stilling as she turned to face him. "You've brought light back into this house, into our lives," Jonathan continued. "And I don't want to imagine a single day without you in it." He reached into his pocket, and pulled out a small velvet box. Opening it, he revealed a simple yet elegant ring. "Clara Mitchell," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. "Will you marry me?" Tears filled Clara's eyes as she nodded, her radiant smile lighting up the garden. Though she couldn't speak, her actions conveyed more than words ever could. Jonathan slid the ring onto her finger, and for the first time in years, Hawthorne Manor felt whole again. Nathan appeared from behind the bushes where he had been watching, his face glowing with excitement. "Does this mean we're going to be a family?" he asked, his voice trembling with hope. Jonathan knelt down and pulled his son into a tight embrace. "Yes, Nathan," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We already are." As the sun set over the manor, the three of them stood together in the garden, a family forged not by circumstance but by love, patience, and the unyielding belief in second chances. The day of the wedding arrived, bringing with it an air of quiet joy and celebration that seemed to infuse every corner of Hawthorne Manor. The chapel on the estate grounds, long unused, was transformed into a sanctuary of elegance and love. Wildflowers, handpicked from the surrounding gardens, adorned the altar and pews, their vibrant colors and delicate fragrance filling the space with life. Clara stood in her room, gazing at her reflection in the antique mirror. She wore a simple yet breathtaking white gown, the lace details reminiscent of music notes woven into fabric. In her hands, she held a bouquet of wildflowers, carefully arranged by Nathan, who had insisted on giving his soon-to-be mother something special. Mrs. Winslow entered quietly, her usual stern demeanor softened. "You look lovely," she said, her voice uncharacteristically warm. Clara turned to her with a grateful smile, her expression radiating peace. Downstairs, Jonathan adjusted his tie, his reflection in the mirror showing a mix of excitement and nervousness. Nathan stood beside him, beaming in his perfectly tailored suit. "Dad," Nathan said, tugging at Jonathan's sleeve, "she's going to be the best mom ever." Jonathan knelt, placing a hand on Nathan's shoulder. "I know she will, son," he replied, his voice filled with conviction. "And we're the luckiest men in the world to have her." As the ceremony began, Clara stepped into the chapel, her steps slow and steady. The soft notes of a violin, played by a close friend of Jonathan's, filled the air, creating a melody that seemed to echo the journey that had brought them all to this moment. Jonathan's eyes met Clara's, and in that instant, the world around them seemed to fade. The unspoken bond they had forged over months of shared trials and triumphs filled the space between them, as real and tangible as the sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows. When the priest asked Clara the question everyone had been waiting for, she surprised them all. Her lips parted, and though her voice was shaky and hesitant, she spoke clearly. "I do." The room fell silent for a heartbeat, then erupted into applause and joyous tears. Nathan ran to Clara, wrapping his arms around her. "You're amazing, Mom," he cried, his voice filled with pride and love. As Jonathan placed the ring on Clara's finger, he whispered, "You've given me everything I never thought I'd have again." Together, the three of them stepped out into the garden, where family and close friends awaited with cheers and congratulations. The celebration was simple but filled with heartfelt moments, laughter, toasts, and even a small violin performance by Nathan, who played the first melody Clara had taught him. Under the glow of lanterns strung across the garden, Clara and Jonathan shared their first dance as husband and wife. Nathan joined them, his laughter ringing out as they twirled him between them. It wasn't just a wedding. It was the beginning of a new chapter, a story of healing, love, and unity. Life after the wedding brought even more changes to Hawthorne Manor, but this time, the changes were filled with warmth and joy. Every corner of the vast estate, once shrouded in silence and sorrow, now echoed with laughter, music, and the vibrant energy of a true home. Clara's influence reached beyond the family. With Jonathan's support, she started a small music program for children in the local community. The manor's once-unused rooms were transformed into spaces where kids could learn and play music, discovering the same sense of expression and connection that had helped Nathan. Nathan, now brimming with confidence, became Clara's biggest helper. He not only practiced his violin daily but also encouraged other children, sharing his own story of transformation. He began attending school again, his once guarded heart now open to making friends and exploring the world with curiosity. Jonathan, too, found himself transformed. He learned to balance his responsibilities as a businessman with his role as a father and husband. Weekends were no longer reserved for work but for family outings, picnics in the garden, and stargazing sessions where he, Clara, and Nathan shared their dreams under the open sky. One sunny afternoon, as the three of them sat on the lawn, Nathan turned to Clara. "Mom," he said, his voice thoughtful, "I want to play my violin for everyone in the village. I want them to know how music can change everything." Clara's heart swelled with pride. "That's a wonderful idea," she signed, her smile bright. Jonathan immediately began helping Nathan plan a small concert on the manor grounds. Invitations were sent out, and the entire village turned up for the event. That evening, under the glow of lanterns and stars, Nathan performed the very first piece Clara had played for him. As the final note rang out, the crowd erupted into applause. Nathan's face lit up with joy, and Clara's heart felt full. Jonathan pulled her close, whispering, "You didn't just bring a voice to Nathan. You brought light to all of us." That night, as the family sat together under the stars, the gentle sound of the violin drifting from the house, they knew they had found something precious. Not just love, but a life built on trust, patience, and the unyielding power of connection. It was a home, not defined by walls or wealth, but by the people within it and the love they shared. As months turned into years, Hawthorne Manor became a beacon of hope and transformation for more than just its residents. Clara's music program expanded, evolving into a full-fledged community initiative that brought families together. The rooms that once echoed with silence now resonated with laughter and melodies. Children from the village arrived daily, some timid and shy, others bursting with excitement, all eager to learn from Clara and her team of volunteers. Nathan thrived in this new environment. No longer the silent, withdrawn boy he once was, he embraced his role as Clara's assistant, often helping younger children with their lessons. His violin skills improved steadily, and his confidence grew with each performance. His story of overcoming grief and finding his voice inspired not only the children but also their parents, many of whom shared similar struggles. Jonathan took pride in the transformation of his family and his home. He often hosted community events at the manor, using its vast gardens and spacious halls to bring people together. During one such event, a parent approached him with tears in her eyes. "Your wife has a gift," she said. "My daughter was so lost after her father passed. But now, she has something to look forward to every day." Clara gave her that. Jonathan's heart swelled with gratitude. He knew that Clara's quiet strength had not only healed Nathan but had also extended its reach far beyond their family. One evening, as they sat in the garden after a busy day, Clara looked at Jonathan, her hands resting lightly on the strings of her violin. Though she didn't speak, her expression conveyed her feelings clearly. She was happy, fulfilled, and deeply at peace. Jonathan reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "You've given this place a purpose," he said softly. "You've turned a house into a home, a place of healing for so many." The culmination of all their efforts came one bright summer evening. Nathan had been working tirelessly on a new piece of music, one that Clara had composed specifically for him. He called it The Journey, a title that reflected not just his growth, but also the shared struggles and triumphs of his family. The performance was set to take place in the largest hall of Hawthorne Manor, which Jonathan had renovated for community gatherings. Word of the concert spread quickly, and people from neighboring towns came to attend. The room filled with the hum of conversation and the anticipation of something extraordinary. As the audience settled, Clara stepped onto the stage first, carrying her violin. She stood silently, allowing the room to quiet before she began to play. Her melody was soft and wistful, setting the tone for the evening. When she finished, Nathan walked onto the stage, dressed in a sharp black suit and carrying his own violin. The audience watched in silence as Nathan took his place beside Clara. For a moment, he stood motionless, his eyes scanning the crowd. Then, with a deep breath, he raised his bow and began to play. The notes flowed effortlessly, weaving a story that spoke of sorrow, resilience, and hope. Clara joined in, her violin harmonizing with Nathan's in a way that felt almost otherworldly. Together, they created a tapestry of sound that seemed to envelop the room, drawing every listener into their world. As the final note faded, the room erupted into applause. Tears streamed down the faces of many in the audience, moved not just by the music but by the journey that had led to this moment. Nathan stepped forward, his voice clear and confident as he addressed the crowd. "Thank you for being here tonight," he said. "This music is more than just notes and melodies. It's a story of how love, patience, and family can heal even the deepest wounds." He turned to Clara, his voice trembling slightly. "And none of this would have been possible without my mom." The audience rose to their feet, their applause thunderous. Clara, her eyes glistening with tears, reached out and embraced Nathan. Jonathan joined them on stage, his heart full as he wrapped his arms around his wife and son. That night, under the glow of the chandeliers, Hawthorne Manor stood as a testament to the power of love, resilience, and the transformative strength of music. Later, as the family sat together on the terrace, the soft hum of crickets filling the air, Jonathan leaned close to Clara. "You didn't just change our lives," he whispered. "You've shown an entire community what it means to truly live." Clara smiled, her hand resting gently on Nathan's shoulder. In the quiet of that moment, surrounded by the family they had built and the home they had created, she knew that their journey was only beginning. The future stretched before them, bright with possibility and filled with the music of their hearts. As seasons changed, the rhythm of life at Hawthorne Manor continued to flourish. What was once a place of shadows now radiated warmth and vitality, not just for the Hawthorne family, but for everyone whose lives were touched by Clara's music and Jonathan's generosity. One crisp autumn morning, Clara was preparing for another busy day of lessons when Nathan burst into the kitchen, holding a worn notebook. His face glowed with excitement as he placed it on the table. "Mom," he said, using the title he now called her with pride, "I've been writing a new melody. It's not finished, but I want you to help me make it perfect." Clara's heart swelled as she opened the notebook, her eyes scanning the carefully written notes. She nodded with encouragement, gesturing for Nathan to bring his violin. Together, they began crafting the melody, their music filling the kitchen with an energy that felt almost magical. Jonathan entered moments later, drawn by the sound. He leaned against the doorframe, watching the scene with a quiet smile. In these moments, he saw the life he had once thought impossible. A family not defined by perfection, but by love, resilience, and the joy of shared passions. That evening, the family gathered in the living room, their laughter mingling with the crackling of the fireplace. As the flames danced, Clara played the finished melody Nathan had composed. The boy sat beside her, his head resting against her shoulder, while Jonathan watched from across the room, his heart brimming with gratitude. As the final notes faded, Nathan looked up at Clara. "Mom, this melody is for you," he said softly. "It's called Our Song, because it's about everything we've been through together." Clara smiled, tears welling in her eyes. Though she couldn't speak, her expression conveyed everything she felt. The melody became a family treasure, played during moments of celebration and reflection. Over time, it symbolized not just their journey, but also their commitment to a future filled with love and hope. Years later, Hawthorne Manor stood as a thriving hub of community and creativity. The music program Clara had started grew into the Hawthorne Academy of Music and Healing, a renowned institution where children and adults alike came to learn, heal, and find their voices. Nathan, now a confident young man, became one of the Academy's leading instructors. His story of transformation inspired countless students, many of whom had faced struggles similar to his own. He often told them, "Music didn't just save me. It gave me a family, a purpose, and a way to share my heart with the world." Clara, now recognized as the heart of the Academy, continued to teach and compose. Though her voice remained silent, her music spoke volumes. She became a beloved figure in the community, her gentle presence a source of comfort and inspiration for all who knew her. Jonathan, too, found new purpose. He expanded his business ventures to support the academy and other charitable initiatives, ensuring that no child who needed help would ever be turned away. He often said, "This isn't just about music. It's about creating a place where everyone feels seen, valued, and loved." One summer evening, the family gathered in the garden for a special event, the unveiling of a new outdoor performance space, built in honor of Clara. As the sun set, casting a golden glow over the estate, Jonathan stepped onto the stage with Clara and Nathan by his side. "This academy began with a single act of kindness," Jonathan said, his voice steady but emotional. "Clara came into our lives when we were at our lowest, and through her music and her heart, she showed us the way back to love and hope. This space is dedicated to her and to everyone who believes in the power of connection and compassion." The audience erupted into applause as Clara stepped forward, her smile radiant. She gestured for Nathan to join her, and together, they played our song, their music weaving through the crowd like a living, breathing expression of the love that had brought them to this moment. As the final notes echoed across the garden, Jonathan joined them, pulling his family into a tight embrace. The audience rose to their feet, their applause mingling with the sounds of laughter and celebration. Later that night, as the family sat under the stars, Jonathan looked at Clara and Nathan, his heart full. "Everything we've built here, everything we've become, it all started with you, Clara," he said, his voice soft but firm. "You didn't just give us music. You gave us life." Clara reached out, her hand resting gently on his. In her silent way, she reminded him that their story was far from over. Together, they looked toward the future, their hearts united in the knowledge that love, patience, and music could truly heal even the deepest wounds. And in the quiet of the garden, beneath a canopy of stars, the Hawthorne family knew they had created something timeless, a legacy of love that would resonate through generations to come.